Cognitive historical empathy. Cognitive historical empathy is a process that leads us to an understanding and an explanation of why past peoples behaved in particular ways. It's founded on a thorough analysis and evaluation of original source materials and historical evidence. Appreciates the multitude of experiences and voices of any given historical moment. Involves an appreciation of the consequences of actions committed in the past. Demands an understanding that the past is different in many ways from the present, and often vastly different. Requires a respect, appreciation, and sensitivity in relation to nuanced and complex human actions. Guides us to evaluate our own biases as we encounter past peoples with an understanding that our own values may determine, and they often do, how we view and judge the past and past peoples. Requires us to attempt to leave behind as much of our own modern baggage before approaching the past and its people. This is not entirely possible, and some believe it's not possible at all. But even becoming aware of this process brings us closer to past peoples on their level. Demands an understanding that the past is filled with horrific moments caused by humans with ill intent, and that to examine the totality of those moments requires us to exercise cognitive historical empathy, even with past peoples we might vilify or find repugnant, or who acted outside the bounds of our own modern moralities. And this is you. You might be male, female, or identify as another gender, but this is you. But imagine this is you. And you're coming to the table, you're coming to the history table with your own baggage, right? And we often don't think that the way we interpret history depends on who we are at the moment. You are filled with your own political beliefs, your religious beliefs. You might be Pentecostal Christian, you might be Catholic, you might be Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, you might be agnostic or atheist. And just your religious beliefs alone might determine how you view history and your own position in the grand scheme of history. Your moral beliefs, your socioeconomic background. Someone who grows up poor on the southeast side of Fresno might look at history differently than someone who grows up in northwest Fresno or the Bluffs or a ranch out in Clovis with property. You might see history differently, right? You might align yourself, or you might have an affinity with different peoples in the past based on your socioeconomic background, your national background, your family history, your race, your ethnicity, gender. If you have Jewish background, and when we study the Holocaust, it's going to hit home a lot harder if you had a great grandparent who went through the Holocaust than if you were someone who may not be familiar with Jewish culture at all, right? Because you have connections to that horrific moment in time. Likewise, if you're African American, at one time, your great grandfather were slaves, most likely, if your roots go back that far in American history. And how you view yourself in history in relation to slavery is different than someone who may not have any relatives who were part of slavery. That will certainly inform the way you see history. Your generation will see history differently than perhaps your parents. You might share a lot of the same worldviews and beliefs and racial background and religious background as your relatives. But because you're from a different generation than your uncles and aunts, your grandparents, your mother and father, you will see things differently, most likely, through your own lenses. All of these things can inform the way you approach history and past peoples. Likewise, we have to consider past peoples. I go over this in my lecture, What is History? But I think I need to flush out this idea more, the idea of historical empathy. I don't think I did it the justice that it was deserved in my first lecture. So when we approach the past, especially the written word, because the written word, the document is the prime source for historians, the written word, what humans wrote at the time when they were alive. So take Columbus, for example. He always looks so happy. Take Columbus. We read his journals. Are we to believe everything that Columbus wrote as fact and take him completely at his word? We have to be critical thinkers. And in order to understand what Columbus is writing, we have to understand the age he lived in. What were people reading during this time? What were the most read books? The Bible, of course, right? We have to know perhaps his economic backgrounds, his political beliefs for sure, certainly his religious beliefs, his moral beliefs. How did he see himself? If you read Columbus's journals, he saw himself as a missionary, probably something that we don't really think about, right? Hernan Cortez saw himself as a missionary too, something we definitely don't think about. His national background, his family history, his race, ethnicity, all these things go into creating the person that past historical peoples were, the same way they make up the person you are. And to truly understand the past and its people, these are questions we need to ask, right? Who were they? What, do they have an agenda? Who were they writing for? What audience are they writing for? Many, many and varied questions when we approach past peoples and documents. Historical empathy. Now, when I say cognitive historical empathy, don't confuse that with compassion or sympathy. Although when we see images like this, most of us, if we are regular, thinking, caring human beings, we sympathize with these young Polish people. All of these young Polish people died at Auschwitz. And you can see the terror in some of their faces as these Nazis, SS doctors take pictures of these unfortunate Polish youth who are about to die at Auschwitz. When I ask you to have cognitive historical empathy, it doesn't come close, right? We try to place ourselves in their shoes. What was it like to sit there as a Nazi doctor took your photos, knowing more than likely that your parents are already dead? What was it like to sit there thinking that you're going to die pretty soon? Being separated from your family and knowing or not knowing whether you will see them again. We can try to imagine the horror, what it was like. But of course, as most of us know, we can't come close, right? What made up this experience? What was it like to be taken from your home in Berlin, stripped of your identity and your humanity, your dignity. I'm given these prison clothes, stripped away from your family, and be called rats and dogs and vermin and a poison to German society, and then killed. We can imagine it doesn't come close. But these exercises are to show us that history is more than just memorization of dates and facts, right? History is about the past human experience, what it was like to be human in all these different situations, the human experience. Now, of course, when we exercise cognitive, intellectual empathy and try to imagine what it was like for these young people, we can't help but have compassion and sympathy. Our hearts go out to them. It's a very black moment in human history. It wasn't that long ago. This is not the medieval times, right? So this is a couple of lifetimes ago, generations that this happened in the world. But what if I ask you to exercise empathy toward the oppressors, the Nazis, the German people? Then it becomes more difficult, right? And perhaps empathy is even the wrong word to use, but this is a word that some historians use to attempt to see the world through the eyes of historical actors. And when I ask you to exercise cognitive historical empathy for perhaps those who we see as villains, it's harder. And then you realize I'm not asking you to have sympathy or compassion, but attempt to see the world through their eyes. And what historical moments led to the point where we have full-blown Nazis? So here's one of the unfortunate young Polish girls to die at the hands of the Nazis in Auschwitz. You can look at her face, and it's not hard to exercise empathy here, is it? What words come to your mind when you stare into her eyes? Hopelessness, terror, maybe a bit of defiance, but defiance knowing that she can't do anything about her situation, a frustration, despair. And we know now, right? We know 6 million Jews died at the hands of the Nazis throughout Europe. Gas chambers, death squads, pogroms across Europe killed approximately 6,000 or 6 million Jews. And this young Polish girl was one of them. So here, when I ask you to attempt to see the world through her eyes, most of us can't help but have compassion and sympathy. Because although we have never gone through the Holocaust, we've all suffered heartache and pain. Perhaps some of you have suffered terror in your life, and you can empathize with this young woman who would die shortly afterwards. But what about this image? I also ask you to exercise. I think the word have is not the appropriate word, but to exercise cognitive historical empathy, which means, well, first of all, these are Germans. These are regular Germans. And down here we see this young man who probably part of a Hitler Youth. He looks like a older teenager, maybe 16 to 18 years old, maybe early 20s. But he is there as a guard, as the Nazi party. Most likely Hitler is going by in a parade. And these regular Germans who aren't necessarily part of the Nazi party, but the neighbors down the street, they're watching their savior go by, the Fuhrer, Hitler, and they're overcome with joy. excitement, appreciation for their Messiah. So I ask you to have a cognitive historical empathy for this young woman. Maybe you're in her early 20s, overcome with joy. Who is that person? What makes her her at that time? What baggage does she bring to the table? Well, most of her life, she grew up dirt poor because the Allies forced Germany to pay for the war debt, the entire war debt. So she grew up a very poor life, and Hitler came on the scene and offered Germany promises, and he delivered. At this moment in time, Germany's on the rise again. The Germans have their dignity back. And these people are appreciative of that fact. Now, when I first show you this image and you see the swastika down here, of course, I think most of us immediately say, well, these are Nazis, these are Germans, they're horrible people. They're monsters. They look like regular people, but what they gave tacit approval to and was a horrific Holocaust, and all of these are just horrible human beings. Yes and no. These Germans were regular people, and given the same circumstances, there's no reason to believe that most of us wouldn't act in similar ways. We need to understand the historical circumstances that led the German people to the point where they turned a blind eye when their Jewish friends began to be taken away. How is that possible? How does a human being get to that point? Because we can all, as humans, if faced with the same circumstances, would most likely react in similar ways. I think if our only image of the Germans in World War II is a full-blown Nazi, we run the risk of simply pitting them as monsters. And as we strip their humanity away, we tell ourselves, well, this can never be me because they are monsters and I'm not a monster. When in fact, the real history lesson is not necessarily gawking at these monsters dressed in leather with SS skull emblems, but the real historical lesson is examining the evolution of the German people from World War I to World War II and how they evolved to the point where they accepted the final solution. It was a process. It was a legal progression, legislation, propaganda against Jews, a gradual progression until they got to the final solution. That's where the real history lies, is examining the evolution, the transformation of humans and their acceptance of horrific things. And this is what I mean by cognitive historical empathy, is placing yourself in this young woman's shoes and understanding what made her, what brought these Germans to the point where they're cheering for a man who has clearly defined his anti-Semitism and has started speaking about the final solution out in public. And these people are okay with it. How do they get to that point? By reading the sources, by examining the evolution of laws, eyewitness accounts, we can come close to cognitive historical empathy. Look at these young women. Sorry, go back. How would you describe these young women? They can be at a Beatles concert, right? Or an Elvis concert or a Green Day. They're overcome with joy. Look at her face. She's so overcome with happiness. She's like about to burst a capillary. She is just overcome as she sees Hitler go by. Again, when I ask you to exercise cognitive historical empathy, we can't help but also couple that with compassion and sympathy. As we look on the back of this slave, this man would have been brought to an inch of his death. And we know from reports that after such beatings, it was common practice to rub salt and chili powder into the wounds so that the slaves suffered more. And we have eyewitness accounts where this occurred and the slaves died because the pain was so intense. Their bodies shut down. Again, like with the young Polish girl at Auschwitz, when I ask you to attempt to see the world through their eyes, we can try because of our common humanity. But given their circumstances, our experiences don't even come close, right? None of us, well, I'm assuming that none of us have ever been a slave or born a slave, and we will not die slaves, as most likely this man did, unless he was freed in 1865. But he would always bear the scars of slavery in his back. What was it like to be totally helpless at the mercy of your white slave owner? What was it like to be a Black man whose wife was raped every night by the white slave owner and you could do nothing about it? What was it like to be a Black mother whose 3-year-old was taken from her arms and sold to another plantation in another state? The deep, intense heartache, what was it like to experience those things? We can close our eyes and attempt to try to imagine, based on our shared humanity. But of course, it's not entirely possible at all, unless you've actually gone through those circumstances. But just, I think the exercise, attempting to exercise this sort of empathy, really helps us understand history in more nuanced ways than in more of on a human level than simply reading your textbook and memorizing dates and figures and names. Again, history, to me, history is about the human experience, the human condition, humanity throughout the ages. What was it like to be human during these times? The horrors, the heartaches, but also the triumphs and the joys of being human. But I would also ask you to exercise cognitive historical empathy for these men. These are Southern plantation owners. This image is in the Smithsonian. These are the type of men that would have issued their taskmaster to whip their slaves. What was it like to be these men? And when I ask you to exercise cognitive historical empathy for these men, I am not asking you to exercise or to have compassion or sympathy for these men. That's not what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to attempt to see the world through their eyes. What made these men who they were? You might just say, well, they're just bad men. They're evil. I don't want to know who they were. Well, this is part of history, is understanding what made these men who they were. What was it about Southern culture that created these type of men? What powers did these men have over Black bodies and lives? What does that say about Confederate or Southern culture at that time in the 19th century? Understanding who these men were and their worldview helps us have a deep, rich understanding of Southern plantation culture. What were their religious ideas? How did they see themselves in relation to Black people? What was their vision for America? What caused them to fight the Civil War? You may ask other questions that allow you to exercise cognitive historical empathy. So cognitive is intellectual, right? Intellectual empathy, not compassion or sympathy, but attempting to see the world through their eyes. Given like circumstances, most of us would act in similar fashion. Take slaveholders, for example. Most of us might scoff at the idea that we would ever be willing to hold another human being as a slave. Sure, given what you know now, all that we have learned about slavery and civil rights, most of us, if not all, would champion the cause of the slave. Perhaps some of us might even foment a rebellion. But if you were born into the elite planter class and grew up along slaves, and were taught that white people were in all ways superior to Black people, that even God ordained Blacks to be slaves for their own good, do you think you would have acted in a different manner? The purpose of this exercise is not to sympathize with slave owners. Do not confuse our idea of cognitive historical empathy with compassion or sympathy. They are completely different. Though all three might ask you to reach out and attempt to see the world through someone else's eyes, to attempt to understand the worldview and perhaps pain. Cognitive historical empathy does not ask you to feel for the past subject, nor feel compassion or sympathy. What, now I use the acronym CHE, asks us to do is to understand the world of the historical actor and how they made sense of their existence and place, so that we have a more robust image and deeper understanding of a historical moment. Take again Thomas Jefferson. Now, I covered Thomas Jefferson in my lecture, What is History? Take again Thomas Jefferson, for example, and many of the other founding fathers who owned slaves. Who were these men? Many of these men constituted some of the most intelligent, enlightened humans on earth at that time. They thought about, argued, and wrote about liberty, freedom, democracy, and equality while owning other human beings. You can imagine Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration while being served by his Black slaves. Jefferson grappled over slavery. He fostered illegitimate children with his mulatto mistress, Sally Hemings. Yet he could not bring himself to free his slaves. His whole life depended on slave labor. If one of the most enlightened persons alive in the world at that time, who could read Latin and Greek text, who wrote one of the most profound documents concerning freedom in the history of the world, could not free his slaves, do you think we would act any different? Cognitive historical empathy pulls us into the endless array of human experiences, even when they are deeply uncomfortable. Here's an image from around 1924 at the height of the KKK phenomena in America, where up to 6% of Americans were KKK members. That's a huge amount of Americans. That's not counting the supporters. Those are just people who on the membership rolls. And here are a group of KKK women. They also had junior chapters where there were children KKK and Fresno High KKK. Well, Fresno High was actually the first high school in California to have a junior high school KKK club in the mid 1920s. So we can look at this image, and I think most of us would say these people were what? Tell me, say it out loud. Horrible. You might even try to demonize them and say they're idiots, right? This is often the words we use to describe people like this. If you don't belong to a group like this, hopefully you don't. But that wasn't the case. It wasn't. I don't want to say that I agree with the KKK in any way. That's not what I'm saying. If 6% of Americans at this time were KKK, then it is incumbent upon us as historians to attempt to understand why this occurred. What made these people, the people they were in 1924, to join the KKK? What was their vision for America? These were neighbors down the street. If 6% of Americans were KKK, that means most neighborhoods had KKK members. Regular Americans. When we exercise cognitive historical empathy here, I am not asking you to have sympathy or compassion or agree with the KKK in any way. I'm asking you to examine the history that led these people to not only enroll in the KKK, but they are marching without their masks. They are out in the open, in public view, in a parade, showing their community their faces, and they are proud to be KKK, and they're waving American flags. And this was one of the major slogans at this time for nativists, KKK, America First. America First. If we know the history and we're cognizant of the historical phenomena that led these people to join the KKK, then we're able to see similar events occur in modern times. Although history is not a science, I don't believe history is a social science. I see it more as a humanity, about the human experience. But there are historical phenomena that reoccur in society and culture over and over again, although the circumstances aren't exact. Just the human elements, personalities, and characters and decisions made by humans complicates history, so that no one two periods are exactly the same, of course. But we've seen this slogan, this motto crop up in recent times, right? America First. Trump often used it, America First. Cognitive historical empathy is an attempt, as much as possible, to see the world through the eyes of past peoples, to try and understand their worldview and accept them on their own terms. Aside from our own modern preconceived notions, filled with our own biases, prejudices, and even moralities, is this entirely possible? No, of course not. As humans, I do not think it is entirely possible to drain ourselves of all our biases and approach history and past peoples with a clean slate. Yet, attempting the intellectual exercise helps us see history in novel ways and unique vantage points, but also connects us with a larger human story, the story of who we are, how we got here, and all the multitudes of roads and voices that led us to this point. Final thoughts on cognitive historical empathy. When we completely demonize past groups like the Nazis or plantation slave owners or any other people we see as villains, we run the risk of stripping their humanity away so that they become something other than human. Not our kind of human, not us. They are monsters in a way that we could never be. In fact, their humanity is no different than ours. The Germans during World War II did not have a different DNA than you and I. Given the same situation and societal circumstances, most of us, a great majority of us, would act the same way. This is one of the fundamental lessons of history, if we will listen. When we take the gaze off the full-blown Nazis and turn it to the evolution of the German people from the end of World War I to the rise of Hitler, and examine how the Germans got to that point, what circumstances, laws, and twisted views, then we realize that we, you and I, could transform in a similar way, given similar circumstances. Cognitive historical empathy.